On a Saturday afternoon in 1911, 146 garment workers had 18 minutes to live, and the doors were locked. It was just before quitting time. The light through the tall windows of the 8th floor had gone golden, the way March light does in lower Manhattan when the day is almost spent. Hundreds of young women sat shoulder to shoulder at long wooden tables, their sewing machines running in one continuous roar, their hands moving the way hands move when they have done the same thing 10,000 times. In a few minutes the whistle would blow. Some of the girls had already started thinking about Sunday. And then, near a table on the 8th floor, under a wooden bin packed with months of cotton scraps, something began to glow. What happened over the next 18 minutes would become the deadliest workplace disaster New York City had ever seen. It would send young women leaping 9 stories to the pavement in front of thousands of horrified witnesses. It would put 2 wealthy men on trial for manslaughter, and it would force a nation that had looked away from its sweatshops to finally look straight at them. This is the story of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, of the locked door that turned a fire into a massacre, and of the strange and lasting way that one terrible afternoon rewrote the rules of American work. To understand why it happened, you first have to understand the world that built it. In 1911, the shirtwaist was the most popular garment in America. It was a simple thing, a woman's blouse, fitted at the waist, often with a high collar and puffed sleeves. Every working woman wanted one, and the factories of New York turned them out by the millions. The biggest and best known of those factories belonged to 2 men named Max Blank and Isaac Harris. People called them the Shirtwaist Kings. They had both come to America as immigrants from Russia, both started with nothing, and both built a fortune stitching blouses. Their company, the Triangle Waist Company, sat at the corner of Green Street and Washington Place, just east of Washington Square Park, on the top 3 floors of a 10-story building called the Ash Building. The Ash Building was new, and by the standards of the day, it was considered modern and fireproof. That word, fireproof, mattered. The structure itself was steel and stone, and it was true that the building frame would not burn, but everything inside it would. On any given working day, the Triangle factory held thousands of pounds of cotton fabric, finished blouses hanging in long rows, tissue paper patterns, and wooden bins crammed with the leftover scraps from the cutting tables. Cotton lint hung in the air and settled on every surface like gray snow. Oil from the machines soaked into the wooden floors. It was, in the cold language of a fire marshal, a building full of fuel waiting for a spark. The people who worked there were mostly young, mostly women, and almost all of them immigrants. They were Italian and Jewish girls, many of them fresh off the boat, some as young as 14. The youngest workers were children by any honest measure. They worked 9 hours a day during the week, and another 7 on Saturday, 52 hours in all, and for that, they took home somewhere between $7 and $12 a week. They sat so close together that their chairs touched. The aisles between the tables were narrow and clogged with baskets and bundles, and to get out at the end of the day, they had to leave through doors that the owners kept locked. That last detail is the one that everything turns on, so it is worth being precise about it. Blank and Harris ran their factory with a deep suspicion of their own employees. They were convinced the girls were stealing fabric, slipping bits of cloth and finished wastes into their bags and their clothing. So at the end of each shift, the workers were funneled out through a single narrow exit on the Green Street side, where a guard inspected their purses. The other main exit, the door that opened onto the Washington Place stairway, was kept locked during working hours. Locked, so that no one could slip out unwatched. Locked, to protect a few dollars of cotton. On a normal day, it was an inconvenience and an insult. On March 25, 1911, it was a death sentence. It is worth pausing on what those 9 and 10-hour days were actually like, because the fire did not happen to abstract figures. It happened to people with names and habits and small daily indignities. The women bent over their machines from morning until evening, and the pace was set by the piece, so they were paid for what they finished, not for the hours they sat. If a machine broke, the loss was theirs. They bought their own needles. They were charged for the electricity that ran their machines and for the chairs they sat in. At the end of each shift, they lined up to have their bags searched by a man at the door, every day, as if every one of them were a thief, and the line moved slowly because there was only the one unlocked way out. Many of them spoke little English. Many of them sent most of what they earned to families in Italy or in the Russian Pale. They were, in the language of the time, just factory girls, and the city had built itself a habit of not looking too closely at how they lived. The fire most likely started with a cigarette. Smoking was technically against the rules, but the rule was widely ignored, and the cutters who worked the 8th floor often had a smoke as the day wound down. Sometime around 4:40 in the afternoon, a smoldering match or a dropped cigarette end fell into one of the scrap bins beneath a cutting table, into hundreds of pounds of cotton clippings, as dry as tinder. For a moment, it was nothing. Then, it was a small flame. Then, in the time it takes to say it, the whole bin was burning, and the flames were climbing the tissue patterns that hung above the table like paper ghosts. A bookkeeper named Dinah Lifshitz was at her post on the 8th floor. A man named Samuel Bernstein, the factory manager, grabbed for the fire pails, buckets of water kept on the wall for exactly this moment. They threw the water, and it did nothing. The fire was already too big, racing along the cutting tables, leaping from one row of hanging wastes to the next, feeding on the lint in the air itself. Within a minute or two, the entire 8th floor was a single sheet of flame. The men gave up on the buckets and turned to the only thing that mattered now, which was getting people out. Here the building's design became a trap. There were 2 stairways, 2 passenger elevators, and 1 fire escape. On the 8th floor, where the fire started, the workers had a head start of a minute or two, and most of them got out, though even there some were caught. But the factory had no fire alarm system, no sprinklers, and no way to warn the floors above, except by telephone or by running. Dinah Lifshitz tried to call the upper floors. She reached the 10th floor, where the owners and the executives had their offices, and she got out the warning. But the 9th floor, the floor with the most workers packed into it, the floor where the sewing machines ran in their tightest rows, got no warning at all. The phone on the 9th floor went unanswered. The girls up there kept sewing while the fire climbed the air shafts and the stairwells toward them, and by the time they understood what was happening, the smoke was already pouring up through the floor. On the 10th floor, Blanc and Harris and the office staff escaped, most of them up to the roof, where students from a law school in the building next door lowered ladders and helped them climb across. Blanc had his 2 young daughters with him that day, and they got out. So the owners lived. Up on the roof, looking down, they could see what was beginning to happen on the street. The 9th floor is where the dying happened. Picture it. A long, open room, 200 or more young women, the machines suddenly silent because the power had cut out, and smoke coming up through the floorboards. They ran for the exits. They ran first for the Washington Place door, the one nearest to many of them, and they found it locked. They beat on it. They threw their weight against it. Survivors later remembered the crush of bodies pressed against that door, the screaming, the heat, building behind them. The door did not open. Some of them found the Green Street stairway, but the fire was already roaring up that stairwell, and only a few got down it before it became impassable. The minutes were running out, and the room was filling with fire. There was a fire escape, a single iron fire escape, on the inside of the building, facing an air shaft. The workers crowded onto it, dozens of them, more than it was ever built to hold. It was a flimsy thing, poorly anchored to the wall, and it did not even reach the ground. It ended at a skylight over the basement, 2 stories up, a fact the women learned only when they were on it with the flames at their backs. Under the weight of all those bodies, and the heat warping the metal, The fire escape tore loose from the building. It twisted, buckled, and collapsed, and it dropped about 20 people, nearly 100 feet down the shaft to the stone below. The fire escape, the one official means of escape from a burning factory, killed everyone who trusted it. That left the elevators. And here, in the middle of all this horror, two men did something close to heroic. The passenger elevators were run by two operators named Joseph Zito and Gaspar Mortillaro. As the 9th floor burned, these two men ran their cars up into the smoke and the heat again and again, packing in as many girls as the cars would hold, dropping them at the bottom and going back up for more. Zito made the trip 3 times. Mortillaro made it until the heat warped the rails and his car would no longer run. Between them, those two operators may have carried 150 people out of the fire, perhaps half of everyone who survived that day. But the elevators could not save everyone, and what happened at the elevator shaft is among the hardest parts of the story to tell. When the cars stopped coming, the girls who were left on the 9th floor pried open the elevator doors and looked down the empty shaft. Some of them jumped, hoping to catch the cables, hoping to slide down to safety. They could not. Their bodies fell to the top of the elevator car below and piled up there, and after a while the weight and the wreckage made it impossible for the car to move at all. 19 bodies were later found at the bottom of that shaft. The very last route out of the building had been closed by the desperation of the people trying to use it. Down on Washington Place, the street had filled with people. It was a Saturday afternoon in a busy part of the city, and a crowd had gathered the instant the smoke appeared. They were looking up, and what they saw they would carry for the rest of their lives. The windows of the 8th and 9th and 10th floors were full of young women, framed in fire, and the women were beginning to come out of the windows. A newspaper reporter named William Shepard happened to be near the square when it started, and he got to a telephone and began dictating what he saw, live, as it unfolded. His account is one of the reasons we know the fire the way we do. He wrote about learning a new sound that day, a sound worse than anything words could carry, the sound of a living body striking the stone sidewalk from 9 floors up. He counted them as they fell. He did not write of victims or of casualties. He wrote of the thud again and again, and of the death that arrived with each one. The firemen got there fast, within minutes, but there was nothing their equipment could do. Their tallest ladders reached only to the 6th floor of a 10-story building. The fire was burning on the 8th and 9th and 10th. The gap between the top of the ladder and the bottom of the fire was 2 full floors of open air, and there was no way to close it. The firemen stretched their life nets on the pavement and shouted up for the women to wait, to aim for the nets. But a body falling from the 9th floor is moving too fast for any net ever made. The women jumped anyway, some of them alone, some of them holding hands with a friend so as not to fall alone, some of them with their hair and clothing already burning. They came down 2 and 3 at a time. The nets did not hold. The bodies tore straight through them and struck the stone. Firemen wept on the sidewalk. Police officers begged the women in the windows not to jump, and watched them jump. It was over in about half an hour. The fire itself, once the upper floors were fully involved, burned out quickly because it had consumed everything that would burn. By the time the engines had it under control, the worst was already done. When the firemen finally went up the stairs, they found the dead heaped against the locked Washington Place door. The bodies of girls who had spent the last seconds of their lives trying to open a door that would not open. They found the dead in the cloakroom, in the aisles, slumped over the machines, on the sidewalk and in the air shaft, and at the bottom of the elevator. The rest of them lay where they had landed. 146 people died. 123 of them were women and girls. 23 were men. Most were between 14 and 23 years old. The youngest victims, by the best records we have, were 2 14-year-old girls. At least 62 of the dead had jumped or fallen from the windows. It was the deadliest workplace disaster in the history of New York, and it would hold that title for 90 years, until the towers came down a few miles to the south. In the days that followed, the city tried to count and name its dead. The bodies were carried to a covered pier on the East River that people came to call Misery Lane, laid out in rows of plain coffins, and families filed past them by the thousands looking for a daughter, a sister, a wife. Many of the dead were burned beyond knowing, and some were never identified at all. 6 of them stayed nameless for a full century. It was not until 2011, on the 100th anniversary, that a historian named Michael Hirsch finished years of patient research and finally put names to the last 6 unknown victims of the fire. The city's grief turned quickly to anger, and the anger had a history behind it, because the workers of New York had tried to warn everyone. Less than a year and a half before the fire, the garment workers had risen up. In the autumn of 1909, thousands of shirtwaist makers, most of them the same young immigrant women who worked at places like Triangle, had walked off the job in a massive strike that came to be called the Uprising of the 20,000. A 23-year-old worker named Clara Lemlich had stood up at a packed union meeting where the men on the platform were urging caution and called for a general strike then and there. And the women walked out, tens of thousands of them, through a brutal New York winter. They were striking for better pay and shorter hours, but they were also striking for their safety. They wanted unlocked doors. They wanted fire drills. They wanted a way out. Many shops settled with the union. The Triangle Waist Company did not. Blank and Harris fought the strike hard, hired guards, and in the end, brought their workers back without recognizing the union and without agreeing to the safety demands. The doors stayed locked. The very conditions the women had marched against in 1909 were the conditions that killed them in 1911. When Clara Lemlich looked at the death toll, she said plainly that a union shop would never have allowed those locked doors, and that the absence of a union was written in the number of the dead. So when the city buried the Triangle workers, the funeral became a protest. On a rainy day in early April, with the unidentified dead being laid to rest, something like 250,000 people came out into the streets of New York. Tens of thousands marched. Hundreds of thousands more lined the route in silence and in the rain. They were not only mourning, they were demanding that someone answer for it. The someones in the public mind were Max Blank and Isaac Harris. The district attorney brought them before a grand jury, and that December the 2 men went on trial for manslaughter. The case did not rest on the fire itself, or on the wages, or on the crowding. It came down to a single, narrow question. The charge was that the owners had caused deaths by keeping the 9th floor Washington Place door locked. To convict them, the prosecution had to prove not just that the door was locked, but that Blank and Harris knew it was locked at the time of the fire and were responsible for it being so. The owners had hired the best criminal defense lawyer in New York, a man named Max Stuer, and Stuer earned his fee. Witness after witness, survivors of the fire, took the stand and described the locked door, the crush of bodies against it, the futile beating on the wood. It was powerful, and it was true. But Stuer was patient, and he was clever. When a survivor named Kate Alterman told her story of the fire in vivid and specific detail, Stuer asked her to tell it again, and each time she told it, she used almost the very same words, the same striking phrases, in the same order. Stuer turned that against her. He suggested to the jury that her account had been rehearsed, memorized, coached by the prosecutors, that it was a performance rather than a memory. He never proved she was lying. He only had to plant the doubt. Judge Thomas Crane instructed the jury on that narrow point of knowledge. The jurors retired, and they were out for less than 2 hours. On the 27th of December, 1911, they came back and found Max Blank and Isaac Harris not guilty. One juror later said something that captured the whole bitter logic of it. He said he believed the door had been locked, but the law, as it was explained to them, would not let them convict the owners unless they were sure the 2 men had known it was locked in that moment. And of that, he said, they could not be sure. The shirtwaist kings walked out of the courthouse free men, and a crowd outside screamed at them as they went. The legal aftermath only sharpened the sense of injustice. The families of the dead eventually brought civil suits, and in 1914, nearly 3 years after the fire, those suits were settled. The families were paid $75 for each life lost, $75 for a daughter. Meanwhile, the insurance companies had paid Blanc and Harris far more than that for their losses, something on the order of $60,000, which worked out to roughly $400 for each worker who died. The owners came out of the disaster ahead. They made money on the fire. And Max Blanc, astonishingly, did not learn. In 1913, 2 years after the fire that he had stood trial for, he was caught again. An inspector found a door locked during working hours at his new factory. The same offense, the same danger, to the same kind of workers. He was fined $20. The judge apologized to him for the inconvenience of the fine. That is where the story of the men ends, more or less. Acquitted, enriched, unrepentant, faded from the public eye. If the Triangle Fire were only the story of Blanc and Harris, it would be a story with no justice in it at all. Just 146 deaths and a shrug. But that is not where the story ends, because the fire did something that the courtroom could not. It changed the law. Here is the part that reaches all the way to you, in your own working life, whether you have ever heard of this fire or not. Among the thousands of people who watched the Triangle factory burn that afternoon was a young woman named Frances Perkins. She was having tea nearby when the alarm started, and she ran toward the smoke, and she stood in the crowd on Washington Place and watched the girls come out of the windows. She never got over it. Years later, she would say that the New Deal itself began on that afternoon, in front of that building. Frances Perkins went on to spend her life on the safety and the rights of working people. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt made her his Secretary of Labor, the first woman ever to hold a seat in a presidential cabinet. The minimum wage, the 40-hour week, the end of the worst child labor, Social Security itself, all of it ran in some real way through the woman who had stood on the sidewalk and counted the dead. But the change began before Washington, and it began in New York. The horror of the fire and the fury of the funeral gave the reformers in the state legislature something they had never had before, which was the political will to act. The legislature created the Factory Investigating Commission, and it put 2 ambitious young politicians at its head, a state senator named Robert Wagner and an assemblyman named Alfred E. Smith. Neither man was a polished reformer. Both came up out of the rough machine politics of the city. But they took the work seriously, and Frances Perkins helped guide them. The commission did not just sit in a hearing room. Its members went out into the factories and the tenements of New York, climbing the same dark stairways and squeezing through the same blocked exits the workers used every day. They held public hearings, more than 50 sessions in all, and they dragged the conditions of the sweatshop into the daylight. What came out of that commission changed the state and then the country. Over the next few years, New York passed dozens of new laws, more than 30 of them, a wave of regulation that had no real precedent in America. Doors in factories now had to swing outward, so that a crowd pressing against them would push them open rather than jam them shut. Doors could not be locked during working hours, ever. Buildings above a certain height had to have sprinkler systems. Fireproof stairways and adequate exits became the law, not a courtesy. There had to be fire drills, so that workers would know the way out before the smoke came. Limits were placed on the hours that women and children could work, and on the labor of children altogether. Factory inspection, which had been a joke, was given real teeth. There is a reason the change had to be forced this way, in blood and in public fury, rather than agreed to quietly. For decades, the American answer to the dangers of the factory had been that a worker who did not like the conditions was free to quit. The law treated the deal between owner and worker as a private contract that the state had no business touching. Safety was a matter of charity or good business sense, not a right. The Triangle Fire broke that idea in New York. It made the argument, in a way no one could look away from, that when a man locks a door and 146 people die behind it, the public has every right to reach into his factory and tell him how to run it. That principle, ordinary as it sounds today, was genuinely new, and the fire is a large part of why we now take it for granted. These laws were the strictest in the nation, and they became the model that other states copied. The fire codes you live under right now, the reason there is an illuminated exit sign at the back of the movie theater, the reason the door of your office building pushes open instead of pulling, the reason your workplace has sprinklers in the ceiling and a marked path to the street, the reason a fire drill interrupts your day twice a year, much of that traces back through a direct line to the bodies on the sidewalk of Washington Place. Those young women paid for the rules that protect you. They paid in advance, and they paid in full. The building is still there. The Ash Building was never destroyed. It was renamed the Brown Building, and today it belongs to New York University, full of classrooms and laboratories where students walk past the very windows that the workers jumped from. There are bronze plaques on the corner now, and in recent years, a permanent memorial was added, naming the dead. Every year on the 25th of March, people gather on that corner. A fire truck raises its ladder up the side of the building, and it stops where the ladders stopped in 1911, 2 floors short, and a bell is rung, and the names of the 146 are read out loud, one after another, into the same March air. Think about what they were doing when the fire found them. They were not soldiers or sailors. They were not doing anything dangerous or heroic. They were sewing blouses on a Saturday afternoon, 14 and 16 and 19 years old, thinking about Sunday, earning a few dollars to send home or to keep a family fed. They had asked, the year before, only to be allowed to live through a fire if one came. They had been told no, and the door was locked. The next time you notice an exit sign without really seeing it, or feel a door give way outward under your hand as you leave a crowded room, you might remember where that came from. It came from a fire that lasted about half an hour, in a building that still stands, and from 146 people who never made it down the stairs. They lost everything on that afternoon, in 1911. What they won for the rest of us. If you want more true stories from the world that was, the kind that still shape the world you live in, take a moment and subscribe.